Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, wherever you are in the world. And welcome to this week's edition of the Thursday Talk webinars on DME for Peace. Just in case you've forgotten, or maybe you might be new to the Thursday Talks, my name is Jack Farrell, and I am the DME for Peace project manager at Search for Common Ground, based in London in the UK. Now, I'm really excited for today's webinar, the second in our series on digital adaptation and technological innovation in peace building, which we're conducting in partnership with BuildUp. In light of COVID-19, there is a need for practitioners across peace building, development, and humanitarian nexus to embrace technology as a means to build peace and create enduring change. And as the nature of our day-to-day work changes and we move more and more sessions, meetings, and workshops online, good online facilitation becomes more and more important. What works in person doesn't necessarily translate to digital formats. And to help us better understand online facilitation, I am delighted to welcome Waidehi Gokhale, CEO of Cilia, to the Thursday Talks. And Waidehi is going to lead a discussion on online dialogue facilitation tips and tricks. Just a note, if you have a question during Waidehi's presentation, you can write it in the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the Q&A. I'm now going to hand over to today's guest, Waidehi. It is wonderful to have you on the Thursday Talks, and feel free to take it away when you're ready.
Thanks so much, Jack. So welcome, everyone. And as Jack was saying, you know, this is an interesting moment for so many of us around the globe. And one of the odd things that has taken place, perhaps, is that we're living at a time where all of a sudden everything has gone online, and that means everything from schools to meetings to lectures to my child's violin lessons to doctor's visits, and this thing that was, you know, technology being a tool that we maybe used in parts of our lives has become kind of a central feature to so much of what we're doing on a daily basis. So when I was invited to do this talk, I was more than happy to try and share some of my experience in this field. And so to begin with, I thought it might be helpful for people to understand why me. And so those of you who are already familiar with Soliya, bear with me. I'm going to just give a very brief intro to contextualize here. So as Jack mentioned, I work with an organization called Cilia. We have been around for about 16 years, and our mission is to prepare young people to approach difference and differences constructively. We strive to have them lead with empathy in order to thrive in what we perceive to be an intrinsically interconnected world. And we've been doing this for 16 years through technology-enabled engagement and learning. So in other words, everything that Soliya has been doing has been linked to online engagement. So we refer to our work as existing in the field of virtual exchange, which may or may not be familiar kind of terminology for all of you. It's a relatively new field, and we like to think of it as sitting on the nexus of three existing sectors. So you have the technology sector, you have conflict transformation, or if you'd like, peace building, and global education. And virtual exchange, and certainly Soliya's model of virtual exchange, sits squarely in the center of this Venn diagram. So to give you some basic statistics, what we've been running are dialogue and training programs. Our programs are all based on a very specific and honed model. So our dialogue and training is done small group, it's multilateral, it's sustained, meaning the same group of people meet over a period of time, and it's synchronous, which means that you are live on camera and in voice with others who are having that dialogue process with you, or doing the training with you. We have been running our programming, our dialogue and training programming internationally for 16 years. And as it happens, we are about a month from launching our first domestic dialogue initiative here in the United States. To give you a sense of scale, so this year we will engage about 6,500 young people in dialogue around the world, and we will train approximately 1,400 people. So that, I just want to share those things briefly with you to give you a sense of what we've been doing, so that you have a sense of where my tips and tricks are coming from. And then, in order to speak to the impact of what Soliya has been doing, I thought I'd share just briefly what we've learned, because I think one of the things that people struggle with is folks who are used to doing peace building and dialogue and training work in person often struggle to feel convinced that the same level of impact or engagement can happen online, which is fair. But our learning has been year on year that if you design the process well, and if you are very deliberate about your roadmap, your facilitation, and the modality that you use, virtual engagement can be just as powerful. And so some of the things that we've learned through our program is, as measured by partners of ours from the field of neuroscience, is that, again, with those caveats, if it's designed well, you can approximate physical contact through virtual contact, particularly when you're working with youth who arguably don't make that much of a distinction anymore between those whom they meet only online versus those whom they meet in person. We've learned through our monitoring and evaluation that you can affect change on people's levels of empathy, on people's levels of identity overlap, and you can have an impact on decreasing dehumanization, tendencies for people to dehumanize one another when you're creating intergroup contact. We also have learned that you can build skills through dialogue and training programs online that are transferable. We've learned that by engaging in dialogue online, young people are then able to take that and execute on that in their digital citizenship. So that means by going through deliberate dialogue programs where they engage with others from elsewhere, they are able to then have a different voice in their own interactions, in their own online communities and spaces. And then finally, that what we hear very solidly is that the skills and experiences that are gained and practiced through the online medium are then taken into their on-ground lives. And so young people, trainees, all participants will say quite clearly that they use what they learn through the online experience in their day-to-day, which is pretty important as well. So I do want to just make sure that we touch base briefly on the idea that there are lots of models of online engagement, and mostly I will be bringing you my experience and examples based on the model that we have been running, but that's not to say by any means that it's the only model. So models of online engagement, if we're thinking about specifically about learning and peace building, there is bilateral. You could be bringing classrooms together. You could be doing it asynchronously, which essentially means that you're doing it think about a social media feed, where people are engaging in their own time, and they're not seeing each other while they're engaging. It can be unmoderated, which is social media and or comment boxes. It can be single experience. It could be a meeting, it could be a webinar. But today specifically, as I said, I want to bring to you kind of our learnings about dialogue, online dialogue. So designing an online dialogue process, I would say, is not that different from designing any dialogue process, which I'm sure many of you have loads of experience with. So, you want to create very clear roadmaps around what you're trying to achieve, clear outcomes on what you're trying to achieve. This is super important when you're setting up any kind of process, even more important when you're setting up an online process. So at Soliya, in thinking about our dialogue programs, we have built them with a view to increasing certain skills, certain attitudes, as well as ensuring that the process of engaging in the dialogue program renders young people activated in a civic sense. And so those are our macro outcomes, and then everything that we do as part of the dialogue process threads to those outcomes. The second thing you want to make sure of is that you have a roadmap. Where do you want the dialogue process to go, and how are you going to get there? Now, this can be session plans, it can be a curriculum, it can be resources, or it can be a combination. So again, I'm going to continuously use the example of what we do, but I will caution that very clearly that this is just one example. So for us, our roadmap is a sort of a flexible curriculum where there are recommended things that are to take place as part of the dialogue process, but then there's a very core principle of learner-led. And so the idea is that every small group of young people that comes together, our groups tend to be young people of about 8 to 12 in each group. And the hope is that the group drives some of the substance and content of the dialogue. So that means you have a curriculum that has suggestions and ideas, and then also the ability for each dialogue process to be organically different based on the participation. And then part of the roadmap, of course, should also be resources for engaging, for participants to engage with in order to deepen the learning that's happening as part of the dialogue process. The next one is choose your modality. Relevant also if you're planning any dialogue process, very relevant if you're planning a technology-based dialogue process. You want to make sure that your modality matches your outcome. And so thinking back to the previous slide in talking about the fact that there are many different types of online engagement, you want to make sure that the technology that you're choosing is aligned with those outcomes. You want to ensure that the technology that you're choosing is designed to help provide you with what you need, the right vehicle to conduct the dialogue process. You want to make sure that you are well versed in the safety and security backend of the technology platform that you choose to use. And interestingly, right now, of course, everybody will have heard about security concerns around Zoom. I'm going to say to you that that was a situation where the floodlights opened up on Zoom cause of the decision that Zoom made to provide this technology for free in this moment of the pandemic. But the truth is that I think that if we had put side by side all the privacy, information of all available technology platforms, there would be a lot of crossover. So it's certainly not just Zoom, it's any platform, and there are ways to make them safe. It's just really important to make sure that you look into that. Just to give you a glimpse really quickly of the technology platform that Soliya uses to help kind of illustrate what I've been talking about. We have a proprietary platform called the Exchange Portal, and it was originally designed 16 years ago, and then it was fully revamped and made web-based about 3 years ago. And so the Exchange Portal, as you will see, is very much designed for small group dialogue. And the idea is that you replicate the notion of sitting around a table with a group of people. You have a central chat box that allows you to engage the full group, but you are synchronously, so on video and audio, with a group of people. The Exchange Portal also allows you to have a presenter mode for use with trainings. And so for us, in terms of our outcomes of building skills and creating safety and security and dialogue, this is the right fit. As one of my team members says, it's we are Cinderella and the glass slipper in terms of our model and the platform. So going back to the sort of the core tenets of designing the online process, the next thing you want to make sure you think about is facilitation. You want to choose your model, you want to choose the pedagogy, you want to be clear about the role of the facilitator. For us, our model is, there are a couple of core tenets. We invite facilitators to function sort of as the invisible hand of the market. It links back to the idea of learner-led process. We want groups to have ownership of the process, so we invite facilitators to be multi-partial. Their job is to bring all voices and all viewpoints to the table and ensure the safety and security of the process. We also invite facilitators to guide the process into the curb. Little counterintuitive when you think about peace building, but we feel very strongly that the outcome of dialogue can only be achieved if you are deliberately engaging in the pockets of contention and conflict rather than avoiding them. So our facilitators are specifically geared towards that. And then the last one is creating the right environment, which is a big one, and that's really about the space that you create online. So your technology is your modality, and your pedagogy and method, comes from your roadmap. But in order to get there, one of the big things that is really important in any dialogue process is creating the right environment. And so I'm going to move us now to talking about what's the distinction then really between doing it in person and doing it online. So some of the opportunities that we've experienced by doing our work almost entirely online over the last 16 years is that we have been able to bring together young people and people around the globe overcoming many hurdles. So geography, social, political, from conflict zones, from post-conflict zones, young people who may not have the opportunity to travel due to all kinds of restrictions, ranging from, a visa to family to whatever it is. Technology allows you to bring those folks together. It also allows you to bring folks together from folks who wouldn't otherwise choose to come together, because it offers sort of a safety. it provides, doing dialogue online provides you with the opportunity to create what we call spaced engagement. So it allows you to bring people together, and then they can, at the end of your dialogue session today, you close up your computer or your technology and you walk away from what you discussed into your own environment. And then you come back a week later and you do it again, and you come back and you do it again. And what that allows is sort of a percolation and a digestion of process that creates a longevity to the learning that happens in the dialogue process. This is what we have understood from our evaluations. It also creates a bravery in engagement. There's a way in which if I can't touch you, I may be more, I'm more emboldened to ask questions that I would struggle to ask you in person. We find that happens, but it obviously with facilitation, it varies from group to group, but we do find that people are willing to go to spaces where they would find it harder to go to. That's not to say, I don't mean to say coercive engagement, but I do mean to say brave engagement, asking all the hard questions. And it also allows a sense of practice. So you're in this online space and you're practicing dialogue and you're practicing these skills, and then you turn around and you utilize them in your day-to-day. And there's a way in which, again, by being online, there's a leaning into that practice we find with participants. The challenges, the first one, and it's glaring, is digital disparity. So when you are choosing a platform, you want to be very careful and think about where you are bringing people together from, what the opportunities are in terms of the types of technology that you may want to use, and what's going to make it possible to create some measure of equity as you bring people together. There's a very different cadence to engagement. It's much harder, for example, to do dialogue that goes on and on for a long time in an online space. You know, ideally, when you're doing dialogue online, you want to slow things down a little bit, and you want to ensure that you're not having cacophony. So, you know, many of you will know that, at least if you have over the past few months, realize that there are best practices around when there's a group of you in a room. Most people will ask that people are muted when they're not speaking. In our platform, we have an actual talking stick methodology where only one person can hold the mic at any given time. It does slow the conversation down, but it allows for any kind of imbalances in technology to be offset by that. Another challenge with online dialogue is stamina. It's hard to pay attention for that period of time. It does, of course, help if you can see each other on camera, but even then, there is a way in which your attention span can wane really quickly. And then, of course, you know, for those of you who are kind of career facilitators, you'll know that instinctively it's a little harder to read a room when you're doing something online. And so I'm going to run through, and forgive me for those who may be past the beginner stage here, but I'm going to run quickly through just some bullet point best practices in a few different arenas, starting with really simple things like make sure you use a headset. It absolutely changes the quality of the engagement. Encourage participants to use headsets. It's going to change their quality too. In terms of a camera shot, you know, everybody should be reminded that what they see is what everybody else sees. It's worth adjusting to make sure your face is in full camera. Your own comfort level. So as you head out to facilitate, I would encourage you heavily to practice with whatever mode of technology you select. You as the facilitator need to feel as confident as you can with the tools that are available to you, but also with the hiccups. And most importantly, as the facilitator, your response to tech hiccups is going to be contagious to the rest of the room. And so the big thing to remind yourself of is to stay calm. In terms of room management, I should have put room in quotation marks. I'm talking about the online room. It's important to read the room. So what does that mean? As I said before, this is actually a challenge. It's harder to know how to do this. And you want to pay attention to people's facial expressions, people's body language in the room, and again, a lot of this is just about practice. You want to be able to use some form of a chat function to offset any issues that people might be having with audio or video. You also, I would heavily ask people to consider using a co-facilitation model, because there are so many things going on when you're using an online space. It's often helpful if there are two of you in the room. There is a lot of multitasking because you are managing people's technology, your own technology, the actual process, the chat box, the cameras, the breakout rooms if you have them. So again, getting used to the idea that there's a lot of multitasking, and that doesn't even include things like if you're taking minutes or notes or trying to document the process in any way. And then one big thing about room management is your job as a facilitator is to ensure that all voices are at the table. So being really mindful if there are people who are having issues or people who are being less talkative, to find a way to bring that voice to the room. The other one's time management. This one's tough online, and I think the core thing I would say is everything has to be a little more explicit. When you're running, a dialogue workshop over the period of a weekend, when you plan that out, you plan breaks, you create lots of opportunities for interactivity. You're mindful of how long things are going to go for. There's an agenda. There should be no difference when you're doing it online. All of those things apply, and they apply more. It's really important to read the room, to know when people need to take a break. I would definitely advise you not prepare to do any kind of dialogue process that exceeds a 3-hour window or a 4-hour window at the very most. In one go. You want to ensure that there's a lot of interactivity brought into the room, and that means that means everything from ensuring that you're breaking the room up into smaller groups, or you're creating opportunities for people to engage, people to speak, of course, but also for people to form that group trust and the idea of culture in the group. So icebreakers, activities, all that kind of thing are incredibly helpful for creating that. And then explicit timekeeping, which, by the way, I haven't done very well today. So to ensure that you're staying on track with the time of each element of your process. And then finally, the piece of creating the space, which I talked about before. When you are bringing people together in any form of dialogue, let alone dialogue that you imagine could be contentious or difficult, it's ideal to have some kind of ground rules that are agreed to by the group. Another thing that's really important to do in this medium is naming dynamics. So talk very explicitly about power dynamics at the front end, and that includes technology, that includes language, that includes anything else that could be interfering with the process or proving to be a hurdle for more for some people than others. Don't be afraid to name the dynamics. In order to have conducive dialogue, which you all already know, you need to create not comfortable spaces, but actually safe spaces that are slightly uncomfortable. So think of them as safe spaces moving to brave spaces. So enable people to feel like they can ask the difficult questions rather than to skirt around things and hold hands. Ownership of process we already talked about, and then grappling with conflict. So when you're trying to grapple with conflict online, there are all the different elements and tools available to you that I've mentioned. So for example, this is another reason why co-facilitation is quite important. Another reason why using the whatever form of chat box that you have, or another means of engaging people behind the scenes. So whether that's through another additional tech platform, if you are able to use a platform that has the breakout room function, that's very helpful if you're going to do any kind of dialogue or training. Grappling with conflict, again, I think it has to be much more explicit, and it has to be, you have to rely on the people that you're bringing together to commit to be grappling with conflict as it arises. So I will pause there, Jack, and I'll leave this up. At Cilia, we have a variety of trainings available for people that are directly linked to facilitation, as well as professional development workshops that dig deeper into certain arenas of facilitation. And so feel free to reach out.
Waidehi, thank you so much for a wonderful and sort of so detailed presentation. I know we ran over what we sort of had initially scheduled for the time allotted today, but I figured time management wasn't that important because the content was so good. I think you've given us a lot to digest, and I would love to use my moderator's privilege to ask a ton of questions that I have. But we have over 250 people live online today who have already been asking questions.
Okay.
Before we get there, though, I love your points on practice and duration. I think on the practice piece, we often take our familiarity with technology for granted, and that can often cause us to be a bit lackadaisical. Like, for example, when we were doing the webinar run through with you the other day, nobody's audio was connecting to the microphones. So that's like a good example of making sure you're familiar with the space around you, and that allows you to create a safe space. And then just on the duration piece, I've been really impressed by my colleagues and sort of other organizations turning in-person workshops and conferences to sort of digital conferences. Setting up an 8-hour online session is not how to do it. And I can't imagine anybody enjoys staring at their screen for 8 hours straight. And I think one of the good examples of an organization who did this well recently is CIPRI and the Stockholm Forum, where they spread sessions out across days, across weeks, on topic and theme. So it was really engaging and allowed us, like you said in your presentation, it allowed the content to percolate and allow us to come back refreshed for the next discussion. To our audience, this is your time to shine. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar or new to the Thursday Talks. You can submit a question in 2 ways. The first is through the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, where you can type your question. The second is to click on the hand icon to raise your hand, which will allow you to ask your question live as we unmute your microphone. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. And just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace, so those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion. But yeah, one of the common questions, Waidehi, that we got from a number of members of the audience today is, how were you able to engage people from different social statuses, from different levels of access to technology and dialogue? Do you have any examples of taking them through both divergent and convergent thinking processes online?
That's a great question, and one that we really grappled with, because in terms of our dialogue process, the participation comes largely from youth who are what we term as college aged. And so when we first started, we worked almost entirely with young people coming straight from campuses. And this was a question we got asked all the time, which was, but you're just bringing together the choir. And so what we've worked to do over the years is to diversify that through thinking about what kinds of institutions we are bringing together. And so diversifying that as much as we can, thinking rural, urban, 2-year, 4-year, technical, vocational, and then going further into areas such as institutions that are non-formal education, if you like, or specific. So things like military academies, religious education centers, language centers, and then finally further into youth centers where you're working with young people of that age group, but who are not engaged in any kind of formal education. And so that's how we worked to really kind of diversify the population. In terms of technology, so it has been an evolution for us. There was a time where it was very difficult to reach folks in rural parts of many countries, and then it was we contended with things like firewalls in countries and places where governments were less comfortable with bringing technology in or allowing for dialogue to happen, engaging technology. And we've learned that creating institutional partnerships that are local has helped that in a massive way. A lot of R&D in terms of understanding bandwidths and capacities of different geographies, being very upfront about limitations for ourselves. So when there are times when we cannot get around firewalls, having to accept that in that moment or at that time or for that duration, that we are unable to partner with institutions in that particular geography. And then also one of the commitments that we made really early on in terms of our core programming was to not have bilateral programming. So we bring together quite deliberately people from all kinds of different geographies. And the idea behind that is that you create a dialogue process that isn't centered on one specific conflict. So that's our core model. Now, we also partner with people to help build out other programs with other demographics. And in that way, there have definitely been moments where we've built out dialogue processes that feel more bilateral, but that's not how we've run them. And so I think, in ensuring that you're addressing all the possible dynamics that are going to come up, the biggest learning for us has been to do our research and to ensure that we have an understanding of the populations that we're bringing together, to open very transparent lines of communication with partners and networks to ensure that we're not being blind to things, and to elicit an incredible amount of feedback.
Thank you, Waidehi. It's really helpful, and again, such a detailed answer. Our next question comes from Rhett Sangster, and Rhett writes, in terms of time allowed for a dialogue, you mentioned no longer than 3 or 4 hours. What is the sweet spot in your experience? Is 2 hours best? 3? And if so, how many breaks do you take?
Good question. So for our dialogue processes, our sessions are 2 hours, 2 hours at a time. In those 2 hours, there are no designated breaks really, unless the facilitators read that it's necessary. There is a way in which technology creates natural breaks. Someone drops off, something happens to someone else's mic, whatever it is. And so there is a way in which in a 2 hour window, often that time passes quite quickly. We do conduct training in a different methodology, and so sometimes trainings are 4 hours long, but that's the longest ever. In which case, then again, I think trainees would read the room, but 1 or 2 short breaks are good to have in a 4 hour window. But my strong suggestion would be the sweet spot's 2 hours.
So we have a number of questions about this idea, and it's how many people leave a session, and what is the average dropout rate? How do you measure whether sort of the training itself or the online session has had the sort of desired impact?
Okay, so the two questions there, I think. So one, in terms of attrition, so again, coming from a place of learning, what we've learned is if you can create an association between whatever it is that you're offering with something that exists in the sphere of the participants who are engaging, that's ideal. So in other words, for us, if young people are coming from a campus, it's usually directly embedded into a course. So the attrition rate is drastically lower for us because there's a accountability built in to it. In terms of general attrition rate in online learning, I think if you can push anything over 50% to completion, you're doing well. I think, and then in terms of measurement, how do you know it works? We spend a lot of time on measurement for both training and dialogue. We do pre and post engagement surveys that are, not just about sort of the quality of, how was the program, but also embedded in there are change measurements that we have worked on and tools that have been built for us through partnerships with M&E experts, specifically some cognitive neuroscientists who are really interested in the idea of rendering change on empathy and dehumanization and all the things that I mentioned earlier. So we do pre and post, and so I would definitely encourage everybody to think really carefully about how you want to measure and institute that at the front end. The other things are you could do, there are other moments in our programming where we've done things like mini surveys at the end of every session, where there are just 3 questions. We've done focus groups, we've done control groups. So it really depends on the depth and duration of the process. It depends, where and how the dialogue is being embedded, as to how you can go about with measuring. But I would encourage everyone to make a commitment to understanding change from before and after participation.
Thanks, Waidehi. I know we're nearly at time, but Waidehi, would it be okay if we ran a couple minutes late just to get a couple more questions in?
Absolutely, I have time.
Perfect. So I am going to unmute Sarah Delson. Sarah, your microphone is now live. Feel free to ask your question.
I'm sorry, I didn't prepare a question. I must have unmuted myself. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. Well, it's lovely to hear your voice anyway. One of the questions that we've been asked quite regularly, Waidehi, is your recommendation about wearing a headset and the importance of good audio. Could you just sort of elaborate a little bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's just a best practice because there's a way in which a headset will cancel out even any headset will reduce background noise. And when you're online and contending with varying technical capacities, one of the core principles of dialogue has to be maintaining people's voices at the table. So to give you a concrete example, our original platform was such that if people's bandwidths dropped, both their video quality and their audio quality would suffer. And so when we went into the redesigning process, one of the principles that we held very hard onto very hard is there a way we can create a platform whereby we ensure that the voice remains at the table? Because there's it creates a massive power dynamic if in the room you're constantly losing some people's voice. And one safeguard to that really is if people use some form of a headset. And you can't see me, but I'm just using, a pair of old earbuds, so like an Apple headset or whatever, but it's old. It's just the usual kind of goes into my ear. There's nothing fancy about it, but it makes a huge difference to my audio.
Yeah, and there's a ton of research that says from podcasts that basically say if you have poor audio quality, people will never forgive you for it.
Right.
So definitely a sort of a tip that I would take on board. And I know myself, I have a very elaborate headset that has noise cancelling, but for some reason the microphone seems to drop in and out now and then. So I apologize for that, guys. Thank you for sticking with us. I'm going to make time for just a couple more questions. This next one comes from Julie Hawk, who is our partner at Build Up. And Julie writes, how do you balance partnerships that are politically motivated or funded, for example, the US in the Middle East and North Africa, and your own goals and reasons for doing virtual exchange?
It's a good question. Julie's also very, very familiar with us. And so I think that we have, again, coming from a place of lessons learned, we've learned that it's really important to have those conversations with partners and supporters at the front end. And it's really important to know what your red lines are. So, concretely then, what are your red lines on branding? What are your red lines on public communication of the partnerships? What are you aligned on the level of transparency that you're willing to use? In terms of what you're communicating about who's supporting the work. Are you aligned on the outcomes? How are the outcomes going to be used? What data? Not just evaluative data. What evaluative data are you going to be sharing with partners? In what form? And then just plain data. People's data. What are you going to do about that? And so we found that the more detailed and explicit your conversation around that can be at the front end, the more you can frankly decide whether or not you are willing to engage in a partnership. And I make it sound like it's clear cut. Of course it's not. And you end up in negotiating those details. But I think I would encourage everybody at the outset in themselves, their own organization, their own organizing entity, to be clear on those before engaging in those conversations with partners and supporters. I hope that helps answer your question, Julie.
That is a great answer and a great question, Julie. One other question which has popped up quite a lot, which we can sort of round out today's conversation with, Waidehi, is what languages does Soliya work in?
A good question. So the majority of our work happens in English. And the reason for this is partly just our capacity as a small organization, but actually, moreover, as I said earlier, we are a little relentless in our feedback loop from our partners. And what we learned over and over again was that young people and our partner institutions were finding that having the opportunity to use English in these spaces was of huge value and tremendously valued by the participants, because it's such an unusual way to be able to practice your language. Now, this, of course, then means that this has to be named very clearly as a power dynamic. Our facilitators are very much trained to contend with this. In our particular technology, the chat box accepts Arabic script. So that allows for some moderation to happen. Our facilitators tend to be multilingual. That doesn't always, mean that everybody in the group has someone there with the capacity to translate for them, but it does allow for even though it's happening in English, quite a lot of the population is not, communicating in their first language. That said, we are over the last couple of years have been trying to expand on this, and so at this point, the facilitation training is available in both English and Arabic. There is a version of the training also available in French, and we also have one version of our dialogue program available in all three languages. The social circles are available in English, French, and Arabic.
Thank you, Waidehi. And as we round out today's discussion, there's been a number of comments that aren't questions at the end. I'll just give you a flavor of what's being said. Thank you for such a supportive presentation. There are a number of evaluators and peace builders online that are finding it difficult and psychologically challenging when they're not meeting people in person. And this change is inevitable, and we're having to work more remotely online. This presentation has arrived just in time. So thank you so much for such a detailed presentation and for giving such great time to the question and answer section. To our audience, thank you so much for being a part of today's webinar. This was our biggest ever Thursday Talk webinar, so a round of applause, drum roll please. This is one of the best parts of my job. I get to share and learn with all of you and talk to really interesting people like Waidehi, and I'm really excited for to continue to do this over the next few years with you all. We will be posting the recording of this webinar on the DME for Peace Media Gallery later today, so please feel free to return to it and share it with your colleagues. There is a comment section on DME for Peace that will allow you to sort of continue discussion. Please do. I'm sorry we didn't get through all your questions, but we hope to in the discussion section. Thank you again, Waidehi. This was an absolute pleasure. And thank you, everyone. Please look out for each other, take care, and stay healthy.
Be safe. Thank you for having me, and don't hesitate to reach out to us should you have questions.
Great. Thanks, Waidehi. Talk to you soon.